Let's meet our guest, Sir Jim Pace, the Conservative MP for South East Cambridgeshire, former Minister for Agriculture and Food, and UKIP's Stuart Agnew, member of the European Parliament for the East, also a farmer as well. Thank you both for coming in today. We'll talk about farming in just a moment, but I wanted to start with Norfolk Police because the Chief Constable there has announced that 350 posts are to go. The changes are being made to deliver savings of more than £20 million over the next 4 years. Simon Bailey says the plans represent the most significant review of policing in the county for a generation.
I don't think any Chief Constable joins to oversee a downsizing of the organisation. But that being said, it's my job, it's now my responsibility. I have a responsibility to the communities of Norfolk to provide the very, very best policing service I can on a budget which is going to be reduced.
Stuart Agnew, you're from Norfolk. Your party wants less spending on public services, so are you backing this move?
It actually shouldn't have happened. There was almost an agreement between Norfolk and Suffolk to amalgamate in part those two forces, and that would have cost a few jobs, but not the 350 they're talking about. It would have saved the two counties £4.3 million annually. But
in principle, a saving of 350 posts, is that a good thing or a bad thing then?
Well, it shouldn't have happened, should it? The wrong thing has happened, and so we are going to get poorer policing on the ground as a result, which is disappointing in a rural area, of course.
So, James Pace, austerity is not over yet, and cuts still need to be made.
Well, obviously, I know nothing about the Norfolk situation and can't comment on it. But what we've seen over the last few years, yes, has been a reduction in spending on the police generally, and I'm afraid, yes, austerity hasn't gone away. We still have to get rid of still a very large public spending deficit. So, to concern over the pig industry in our region. 1 in 3 pigs are bred in the east. They generate billions of pounds in sales. They're a vital part of this region's rural economy. But this month, new safety checks in abattoirs came into force, which mean meat inspectors can only look but no longer touch. The inspectors say the new rules raise the risk of biting into sausages or pies containing diseased meat, and that could damage the public's confidence in food from our pig farms. Here's Alex Dunlop.
At a state-of-the-art slaughterhouse in Suffolk, the meat inspectors come to call. At any one time, there are 3 here, manually checking each pig to see if it should be eaten. They often cut into the carcass if they suspect it has any abscesses or lesions. Or at least they did until the 1st of June. Under new European regulations, supported by Britain's Food Standards Agency, inspectors now have to rely on visual checks alone. The abattoir's owner says that means disease will be missed.
We could have an abscess missed, we could have arthritic joints missed, any lesions, abnormal glands could end up in sausages, and we don't want that to happen.
A few miles away, some of the pigs, which will eventually be processed at Kevin Burrows Abattoir.
Yeah, so we're just basically laying down a bed of straw here, just a little bit.
Alistair Butler has 23,000 free-range pigs on his family farm near Blythburgh. For these inquisitive animals, life doesn't get much better.
When we wean our piglets away from the mums, they then go into paddocks in which they can roam and play in, dig as they would do in the soil as their natural instincts, and that's what total free range means.
And that's the message Alistair wants to get out. The last thing he needs is a row over diseased pigs entering the food chain.
As a farmer, I just want to reassure the public that pork is safe to eat.
Stuart Goodaham disagrees. At his farm shop in South Norfolk, meat is the biggest seller. He says only by handling a carcass can you be sure that it's safe.
He's got to physically touch that pig.
Looking at it isn't good enough?
How you got to look at it? You know, they're halved. You know, you've got to move them. You've got to touch them. You know, they might have abscess inside on the joint or something. You've got to physically look at it.
Did you practice some lamb?
Regular customers Charles and Carol Borg agree, and they're the ones who can decide not to buy.
It gives me peace of mind that I'm eating something that isn't contaminated. With a new ruling that doesn't allow that situation to happen, what safeguard have I got as a consumer that isn't happening?
And in recent years, consumer confidence has been dented by avian flu, foot and mouth and swine fever. Pork is a versatile and popular meat. Little from a pig is wasted. Even parts of the head are processed. But last year, 37,000 were rejected because they had lesions. That was before the change in inspection rules.
All those heads, pretty well now, will be going into the food chain, and pig's head meat is used in manufactured meat products, meat pies, pork sausages, etc. Those abscesses are now being minced into the food of consumers in Britain and throughout the European Union. I think it's a backward step. I really do.
Some pigs in the Suffolk abattoir are destined for Asia, and there they insist on manual inspection. And so the FSA has relaxed the rules, but only for the export market, for countries outside the EU. And that, say inspectors, will mean a two-tier system.
Well, we'd like to have spoken to the Food Standards Agency, which is a government department, albeit without a minister, but they wouldn't speak to us and declined. The Department of Health and the Department for Food, Rural Affairs and Agriculture, or DEFRA, both of whom play a role, also refused. The Food Standards Agency did say that the changes would improve consumer protection and sent this statement. The official inspection of pigs will involve less cutting and handling of the carcasses to reduce the spread of harmful bacteria on pig meat. Officials will continue recording and rejecting unfit animals, which means that where abnormalities are found, the meat will continue to be kept out of the food chain. So, Sir James Pace, we heard there in the film that this is a backward step. Do you believe it is?
No, I don't, and I'm sorry. I think your whole programme is a ridiculous bit of scaremongering. It's not going backwards. It is not easing regulations, as your reporter suggested. It's actually a tightening up. As you've just heard from the FSA, all the evidence now is that most food poisoning is caused by microbial infection on the surface of an animal, and that can be spread.
Why then is there one rule for pig meat going abroad and one rule for it staying here? It's a double standard.
I can't apologise or defend the European Union. Presumably, we've got good customers outside the European Union who do not want to buy that if this is the case, if the meat isn't sliced by the inspectors. Because what they're looking for when they slice that, they're looking at the lymph glands, whether it be in the green offal or the red offal or the meat itself. They want to look at those lymph glands because those lymph glands can tell them so much about that carcass. It's an early warning system which you can't see just by looking at the carcass. And so it's a gamble.
So you believe that every carcass, as was the case, should be inspected internally?
I think we should go right back to the beginning, and instead of having expensive vets looking at these things who don't really know what they're looking at, we should go back to the old meat inspector, rather like the matron in the hospital. This is the person who's been now being excluded from the process. His skill at cutting a carcass, looking at those lymph glands, that's going.
So James Pace, is this about cost-cutting, ultimately?
No, it's nothing to do with cost-cutting. Very rarely, where I will agree with Stuart, very rarely does anything that's cost-cutting come from the EU. This is about better food safety.
Didn't they try this in Germany and then had to go back to the original system of being allowed to handle the meat and cut the carcasses?
I believe that has been the case, but what matters is whether there is any real evidence that not inspecting them, not cutting them open as your programme would suggest, that there is any evidence that increases the risk of food poisoning.
Well, staying with public confidence in our food, but to the thorny subject of genetic modification, or GMs. There's been a small but potentially significant change of heart over genetically modified food. After several years of deadlock, the European Union has decided to allow member states to make up their own minds about whether to grow GM crops or to ban them. This region's been at the centre of the GM debate. Scientists in Norfolk, Suffolk and Hertfordshire have led the way in developing the new technology. At the Royal Norfolk Show this week, there was a lot of talk about finding ways to produce more food.
It's important that the UK moves forward and that farmers have a choice in what they do. It's, I think, galling. We've led agriculture probably from the very early days, and certainly since it's become practiced on a sort of industrial scale, and now we're unable to use some of the tools that the rest of the world have, and we must be annoyed about that, I think.
But this region has also in the past been at the centre of protest over GMs, most notably 15 years ago when members of Greenpeace destroyed a crop of GM maize in Norfolk. Environmental groups still have concerns and say they will fight the plans, which could be approved in the autumn. Well, I'm joined by Professor Jonathan Jones, a senior scientist at the Sainsbury Laboratory at the John Innes Centre in Norwich. They carry out research in genetically modified crop plants. Professor Jones, you support the development of GM crops, but you can't have both, can you? You can't have genetically modified crops and protect organic farming at the same time.
Well, I don't think that's true at all. I mean, what we've done is to identify genes from relatives of potato and put them into well-cultivated potato varieties like Maris Piper or Desiree. And these means that those varieties will not need to be sprayed with chemicals to control the blight. And I've spoken to organic farmers who said they'd love to be able to use them, but their trade association prevents them from doing so. So the trade association, the soil association, has created rules that exclude GM methods, improved crops, but that's just for brand distinction.
But what about this whole issue of cross-pollination? That was one of the big issues when this last came up a decade ago, and that surely hasn't gone away, has it?
Well, potatoes don't cross-pollinate anyway because they're grown from tubers, so it's really not a problem with potatoes. If you look at pollen migration, the question you have to ask yourself is does it matter? So, for example, if you've got a herbicide resistance gene in maize, let's say, and enables you to control weeds more easily, if a few pollen grains blow into a neighbouring farm, then if you're not applying the herbicide, then they're of absolutely no consequence whatsoever.
Even to an organic farmer?
Well, I come back to this definitional thing that if there is a grain or two of a GM trait in the field of an organic farmer, then their organic farmer trade association comes down on them. But they don't have to do that because there's no meaningful consequence of it. It's just the politics of purity.
What about the public perception? How easy, or otherwise, is it going to be to change the public perception of these type of crops?
I mean, I'm on record, and I think I've even got a T-shirt that says it. I don't think people are that bothered. I'm not bothered.
Surely
many people are not bothered.
You say that, but they were very bothered. People were very bothered.
There are activists who are extremely bothered and are making a big issue of it. But the ordinary people I talk to, parents of my school kids, my children's school friends and so on, are frankly not bothered. There's a tiny minority of people who are very exercised about this issue. That's certainly true. But I contest the view that the majority of the public has significant concerns.
Well, Professor Jonathan Jones, thanks for joining us today. So James Pace, the professor there questioning whether pollen migration matters. Surely we should be more worried about this multi-million-pound organic industry, shouldn't we?
Well, I think we're right to be worried about organics, and they do play a part. I personally don't worry about buying organic food, but if people want to do so, they're entitled to do so. But we have perfectly adequate food labelling laws now about if food is contaminated with GM pollen, and that is clear. So the consumer has the choice. And your gentleman from the Green Party says we need to have a public debate. We have a public debate in every supermarket every day because consumers choose, and as long as they've got the opportunity to choose non-GM, then that is the debate. They are expressing the choice that is in front of them.
Stuart Agnew, where do you stand on this? Are you worried about the effect on the organic industry?
Right, where do I stand? I was one of the trials growers 12 years ago and took a lot of abuse, but I grew the crops. I refused to bow to the intimidation, and I can confirm it's a very useful technology, saved a great deal of herbicide on that crop. Organic farmers, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. Organic farms are more likely to have ergot in their wheat. That's a poison. Organic farmers are more likely to have stinking bunt in their wheat because they can't use the seed dressers that will stop that. Organic farmers are more likely to have loose smut in their barley, which when they harvest it, those smuts will drift over the hedge onto somebody else's barley. That's a naked grain that will discolour that for malting. These are real nuisances. And talk about potato blight. In Holland, these organic farmers are told, you will defoliate that crop before you become thoroughly unsociable.
What about public perception of these GM crops then? You said you had
public perception.
Yourself
anyone who's eating pork or sausages or bacon is eating GM. Anyone who's drinking milk, cheese, butter, consuming GM. Anyone who eats margarine is probably consuming GM. Anyone who uses cooking oil is probably consuming GM. So if we can eat all these things, why can't we grow them?
Perhaps even more importantly, a large number of people who are receiving some form of medication from the NHS are receiving medication that has been grown via a GM organism. Virtually all the insulin for diabetics being used day in, day out.
So this couldn't happen soon enough as far as you're concerned, both of you?
I think GM is a very important, necessary part of improving and increasing British agricultural production. Let me make one point to you very quickly, if I can. Sooner or later, there will be, almost certainly through GM, a means for wheat, the commonest crop in this country, to fix its own nitrogen like a legume, like a pea or a bean does. That will dramatically reduce the need for nitrogen fertiliser. All the environmentalists want to reduce the input of nitrogen into our environment. That one thing will one day do it, and that's the day when the organic movement will rue the day that they oppose GM.
So James Pace, you ever been rescued under pressure?
Probably, but for the life of me I can't remember. There have been times when I've wanted to be rescued.
Stuart Agnew, when you moved to the EU as an MEP, did that put you under pressure from
I think
away
what
from
we're
farming?
always worried about is people emailing saying, why did you vote like that?
Okay.
And you know, there are double negatives, negative interrogatives, missing votes, checks. You get it wrong sometimes.
OK, thanks very much. Well, that's all for now.